And we were cleared to move forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as long as she has this recording.
Okay.
So we'll start with Linda. You want to come to the table? Linda thinks she's the last man standing on this issue, and has some background that might be helpful as we discuss this rule. So please.
I don't usually sit at this spot. It's kind of weird. This rule was done in response to concerns about seclusion and physical restraint when I was first on the board. So that was 2015. Back then, we didn't have any kind of restrictions on how long students could be left in physical restraint or seclusion. And, I remember the superintendent saying it was the Wild West out there. So we had parents who were very concerned. We had several parents come to us and tell us stories of how their students had been left in seclusion booths for long periods of time. We had one mom who talked about her son who had been left. The school had closed. They'd gone home. The bus didn't drop him off, and she went back to see where he had been, and they found him in a seclusion booth in the room. So that's why we worked on this rule. So what we did was we got Mark Openshaw was chair of licensing then. He got a huge committee of a task force together. We had SROs, school resource officers, we had law enforcement, we had Disability Law Center, Andrew's here. We had the Utah Parent Center, we had counseling, we had just anybody who we felt like could. There were probably about 20 or 25 people on the committee that worked on this. And that was even before Angie was here. Just shortly before Angie was here. And so we worked on this for about 5 months, and we met, 2 or 3 times a month. And we were kind of at a standstill where we couldn't agree on how long, was the best time and what to do and all of those things. So what we did was something I've never seen happened before in a task force, but we found there was a gentleman, a professor, who was the expert on seclusion and physical restraint in the country, and we flew him in. So we flew him into our committee meeting and asked him, he brought all his research, and he answered our questions about how long it is, what's the best time, how the best way to do it, and all of those things. And once he spoke to us, we were all in agreement, and we put that into the rule. And so that's where kind of the background of where this rule came from. And I guess they tell me I'm the last person left from the task force. Everybody else has got new jobs. I've still got this one. So if there's specific questions on why things are in there, I could probably answer them, or maybe Andrew could. Andrew was there. Laura Lee Gillespie also worked on that, and she is now one of our employees, but was working with the Disability Law Center at that time. So anyway, so that's kind of the background.
And I'd like to see if anyone has some questions for Linda, so don't go for a minute. But I also wanted to say we may call on, because some of these are special ed related issues, we may call on Assistant Superintendent Leah Voorhees, and or Jeff may have something to add, and or Corby Eason, and or Andrew, if you would like to speak to this in a minute after we ask any questions of Linda, we'd like to hear from you too. Okay? So first, does anybody, one of the things I wanted to ask Linda, and I'll start off, do you know if the minutes of that expert who's more than 50 miles away, if his testimony is available or his information is available? Would a record
I don't
be?
know. Carol Anderson was one of the people that was in charge of that task force, and she recently left.
I know.
And so,
You don't know if it's recorded anywhere?
I don't know if it was recorded or, I don't know how they were doing it. I was just really new on the board. I was only been on for like
know either.
3 or 4
Leah
months.
doesn't know either. Maybe, because I'd like to hear that personally before I'm necessarily a believer, because I have some questions about exactly those issues, but I'll save the questions and then we'll see. Anybody else have any questions for Linda? Brittany?
I'm just curious if you noticed any of the proposed changes in draft 2 that maybe kind of pulled back from some of the intentional decisions that were made by that.
There was only one thing, and that was the notification. And it says something about 15 minutes, a notification 15 minutes, and that's been crossed out. Now it says immediately, and that's fine. But the reason why it said, and I don't have a problem with it saying immediately, but the SRO said if you put someone in physical restraint, it's kind of hard to call their parents immediately because you've got them in physical restraint. Mm-hmm. It's you and them, and how are you going to grab your phone? And what if there's nobody else in the room to call the parents immediately? So I don't know if you want to put as soon as possible. I don't know how, we debated this a long time because it's kind of a concern if you've got someone in physical restraint. It's to call a parent because you're busy, right?
So you're not really ready to make a motion, you're just asking a question? Okay. And did you have other things
I
to
have
ask, Linda?
maybe
Jenny?
a number of questions, and actually on 176, Linda, you might be able to answer this. I just had wondered, go back up here.
And maybe just answer things, ask things specific to Linda for a minute, and then we'll
Yes.
come back to more general stuff.
So it talks about protective or stabilizing restraints. Let me just go back up to where what category that would fall under. I think,
Is it that far?
I just wondered what that was referring to.
Including prohibition of,
As I remember, and Andrew might be able to tell us better than that, but I think it was like people who were in a wheelchair, stabilizing them, or keeping them so that they couldn't move. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Does that
just
make
because I
sense?
saw protective, and I thought, what are we referring to here?
That's what I think that they were referring to, if I recall.
Okay, so someone who's not mobile and
Yes.
restraining them so they can't. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then should I keep asking?
yeah, as long as they're, I want to get the Linda question so she can return to her committee. And
Okay.
then I'd like to hear from Mr. Riggle.
Well, then,
And then we can discuss the rule generally, if that's
okay. Look, I think that's it. The other things I want to discuss, but they're not
more general, not
asking
specific.
questions about what does this mean. Yeah.
Great. Mike, did you have questions?
I do, but
But not to Linda.
not specific to me.
Cindy, do you have any questions specific to Linda?
Just, I know I was visiting with Andrew earlier, and I think he was saying most of the changes here are technical, except for one is substantive. Is that?
I think that's the one he was talking about, probably the one where we were changing the notification.
Okay, and that's the substantive piece that we're,
Is that the one you're talking about, Andrew? Yeah.
Okay. And I kind of have some questions about that too, but we're just going to wait till Linda's not on the spot. Do you have other?
had a follow-up. Oh, just, do we have any input here from our local schools or boards on that?
Well, I just wanted to get the questions for Linda to start with and then come back.
Then
Can we come back
That
to
would be
that?
fabulous, yes.
Can we come back to that? Okay, thanks, Linda, very
Okay.
much. I think we're good. Pardon? Go ahead.
So in the creation of this, what was the intent to deploy it and ensure it was successful through training? Training is mentioned, but still a little vague. What was the intent to deploy and train?
Well, that was when Glenna was the special ed director. And so we had just created the student services department as well, as I recall. And so the idea was that we were also doing the technical manual at the time. What's that called? LRBI, thank you, at the time. And the idea was to train them on interventions that they could do before they got to this point, before they could do seclusion and restraint. But they, right then, they were not, since the department was just starting, they weren't fully staffed to do it, and they were making LRBI so that it was applicable to all students and not just special education students. It had been just special education students before. And so that there were a lot of changes that had to be happening, but they went out and trained. They did a lot of training. I went to a summer training where they trained people on it.
A follow-up question.
Sure.
On line 70, it refers to requiring training. And how is that going to be monitored through?
I think maybe that's something Leah could probably answer better.
Okay.
Okay, we'll just,
Better.
if you'll just hang on to that idea.
The
for
other
one bit.
question, I had heard there was a question about the 30 minutes and why it said 30 minutes. That was the that was the amount of time that you should have somebody in seclusion or physical restraint, the maximum. And the gentleman that came out had all kinds of research. And what he said was if things haven't changed in 30 minutes, then you need to use another intervention because the intervention you're using is not working. And so, like I said, he had all the research to back it up. And so that's why we went with the 30-minute. As I go out and talk to visit schools, I will ask them how that, not all of them use seclusion booths, but the ones that do, I ask them how it's working, and they don't have a problem with the time at all. They don't think that's, they've found that within 30 minutes they usually calm down. So
Do you know if this guy was an expert, was an IDEA expert, or was he just an expert in student
he was
discipline, or do
he
you
was
know?
I don't remember. They flew him out from a university, and he was a university professor, and that's
So he's
all
an
I
expert.
remember. So he was a researcher from a
Okay,
a
yeah, we'll find out. I
university.
just think that makes a difference. That's one of the kind of general questions. Thanks, Linda.
You're
Thanks for
welcome.
taking your time. Andrew, would you like to come forward and introduce yourself and give us any additional background that you have on this experience? Because you're apparently the other last man in the room that knows about the origins of this.
Unfortunately for you all, that might be true. Let's hope it's not. Good afternoon, committee. My name is Andrew Riggle. I'm the public policy advocate for the Disability Law Center. And as Linda and Carol noted, I, along with Laura Lee, I was heavily involved in the discussions around this and getting it passed through you all, and then with some follow-up legislation that came afterwards as well. Just briefly to address your question about what positioning and restraints used for positioning means. And if I remember correctly, I think when we included that language, we were thinking about things like seat belts in wheelchairs and special kinds of chairs that are used for a student who needs extra support in their seating to make sure that they are able to remain upright and functional, and clarifying that that restraints that are used for stability and positioning like that, restraints or a device like that is not to be used for restraint for punitive purposes. So that, as far as my recollection, that's why that language is in there, and that's what it refers to. I've seen draft one of this language. I have not yet seen draft two. But I will say that our experience with this with implementing the rule up to this point is that it took the board and LEAs quite a while to draft the model policies that are required by in the rule, and I think I'm comfortable saying that we believe that the data collection and reporting on the use of restraint and seclusion by schools and districts is still hit or miss, and so I think one of the things that we're happy to see in this initial draft is a re-emphasis on the responsibilities of schools and districts to report in UTREX on a daily basis in terms of their use of restraint and seclusion, and I'm hopeful that will actually get us some information get all of us some information about how well this process is or is not working for both students, staff, and family. So hopefully we can actually get that up and running in a real way after, I don't know, three or four years. And I think from what my colleagues tell me from their research, that schools are doing more schools are getting policies around these issues in place for their staff. But to your questions about training, I since the language is rather permissive about and leaves it up to schools and districts to decide kind of what that training looks like. We don't really. I don't think anyone really has a good idea yet of how consistent that is or what the variations are around that across the state. So we're hopeful that through the process of adopting this update to the rule, we can all come to a consensus on what we think will get us to a place that will work for all students, for staff, and for parents, and generate the data and the information we need to figure out how effective these policies and these practices are going forward. And as we get further into the discussion, I'm sure we will have more thoughts for you, and would appreciate the opportunity to share those with you as appropriate.
Thanks. And we're not going to solve all those today. You may have to come back.
So,
Is that okay?
thank
Okay.
you very much for the
Thank you.
opportunity.
Thanks for giving us more background.
Yeah.
So if you folks are okay about this, what I thought we could do is go to your questions, and then if the concept requires a vote, we would vote on the concept, so that would give direction to the staff to then bring us another draft next month. So is that okay, or does anybody have a different way to do that that might be successful? Okay, does that work okay for you? Okay, so just go across.
Okay.
Brittany,
Oh, go
did you
ahead,
have
Brittany.
things to start with? Then Jenny, go ahead.
Okay, I just, so line 103, we have a definition of self-discipline. I wondered if we took that from somewhere or if that's specific to something. It says means a personal system of organized behavior designed to promote self-interest while contributing to the welfare of others. I just don't know, is there maybe a better definition for self-discipline besides promoting self-interest? Even though I know it is comparing it to contributing to the welfare of others.
Does anybody know where
Can we
that
look
came
at that?
from?
I
Me
just don't
neither.
know if it's, self-discipline is actually promoting self-interest. So I just wonder if there might be a better way to describe that. And I don't, if it comes from somewhere specific for this, entity, then maybe it's adequate. Okay.
you
Should I
have
move on to
better-
the next
do you-
one?
Do you have better words, or do you?
Well, no, but I could come up with some better words. I just didn't know if it came from somewhere, if there was a reason why we were using that language with this, okay.
Would you guys explore?
Sure.
Go
Well,
ahead.
I mean, there are some out there. I was looking some up, but
I was just going to mention,
Yeah.
we don't have a lot of the background about why certain phrases.
that's why I'd wondered.
Sorry, yeah.
That's why I wondered if there was
But
a
we could-
reason why, in this case, it was,
Yeah.
so, if so, then we can leave it. I just didn't know if that was really the best definition for self-discipline.
Then are you comfortable with leaving it, with them
Yeah, let's
exploring if
explore
there are
it, yep.
any better words? Okay, go ahead.
And then another definition we don't have, which was pointed out, sorry, let me get back to my document. So line 140, again, we're talking, just a minute, let me get down to it. We're talking about social skills, including social emotional learning. What are we talking about? There are so many definitions of what social emotional learning is. What is it we're referring to here? And if so, let's be real specific, even if we have to put parentheses or something. I want to know what we're talking about.
Do you want?
So we could define that. So you're saying, let's
Yeah, I just
define
want to know
social
what that
emotional
is. When
learning.
you're talking
Sure.
about here, I want to know what that is. And
Yeah.
we have civics above it, we have citizenship there. Once again, we have self-discipline up above it. So under social skills, including social emotional, what is it we're talking about?
Okay.
I just want to know what we're talking about. Which I can help put something together too. I just wasn't sure because of this particular thing, if there was something specific we were thinking, or
Okay.
they were thinking or whatever.
If
Let's
anybody
see.
has, and by the way, if anybody, Cindy, Mike, anybody has additional thoughts on the issues she's raising, we might as well discuss them now, so raise your hand if you do. Go ahead.
And then my next, did someone?
No one did.
Okay. And then down on line 39, it just says, shall ensure that each school incident, or 309, not 39,
309, okay.
Shall ensure that each school incident of the school using an emergency safety intervention is documented, ED probably on there, in the LEA student information system and reported to the superintendent through the board's UTREX system. Because I do worry about data privacy and that kind of a thing, I realize we need documentation if we're having a significant event. What things are documented, what things aren't documented, what things stay at the school and in a child's file, what things are kept track of at the state level. And maybe I'm just asking that question. What is it we're talking about here? What incidences are we going to send to UTREX for other people to observe? And some of those are needed, right? Because we need to know what's going on. Some of those, I guess I'm just wondering what incidences are going to be sent on, or maybe it's just simply what is currently sent on. Maybe it's not a question we need to ask here. Maybe it's already outlined somewhere.
So most of this, if not all of it, is already currently outlined in the UTREX manual. So they have a specs manual that states what each data element needs to be, and that manual is supposed to be used by the LEAs to inform what it is they're inputting into the system. And so what we're trying to say here is we want to make sure that they are ensuring that all the incidences that are related to this rule that need to be in UTREX already, that they're doing that. We've been noticing we have LEAs that are reporting 0 incidences generally, and there's a lot of confusion. So we want to make sure that we're reiterating where possible that this is needed. Of course, there is also on the flip side of that, we also need to make sure that we're training that and providing more clarity on what it is the LEAs need to be putting in or don't need to put in. So it's all kind of this is a piece of a larger movement that we have here going on that goes beyond this rule as well, as we look at data standards as well. But that was the idea, is to capture whatever it is we're going to be requiring, make sure that's reinforced in the rule.
Okay, and then, so in that case, I do feel it's important that families know where it's being stored and that an incident is being stored. Does that make sense? So if there is incidents that are being recorded for their children, I just think it's, we're just letting you know this will be on their record for the superintendent or whatever. I just think it's good to know that is, anyways.
Okay, and so Jenny, Angie has something to add.
Yes.
But, and I will have her do that in 1 second, but I also have sort of a different, I thought this was worded kind of, it's hard to understand, so I had some different wording to propose that doesn't take into account your concerns.
Okay.
Which I've noted, and they've noted, they'll get to, but then I wanted to hear what Angie had to say, and then I'll
Okay,
just propose
sure.
the language I thought was a little more clear about that. But go ahead,
Sure.
Angie.
Thank you. So emergency safety intervention is actually a defined term. And if you look above, it means the use of seclusionary timeout or physical restraint. So essentially what we're saying in that language is if a school puts a student in seclusionary timeout or uses physical restraint, that has to be recorded. And so in some ways, I guess when you were saying it's going to be on their record, it almost sounds like it's a student's fault, but in this case, it's actually a school doing something to the student. I didn't know if that was helpful.
Okay,
but-
okay.
So this is about
I see what
when
you're saying.
the student has been physically restrained or put into a seclusionary timeout, that the school has to record that they used that they did that to a student.
Okay,
So that answers your what?
Yeah.
The emergency safety intervention is a defined term.
okay.
So,
Go ahead then,
but
Carol, if you have
where
something.
stored then? So here's how I rewrote it, and it doesn't, I think, change the meaning. It doesn't change that you still want more information, but starting with shall ensure that each school emergency incident where a school employee, because it's not really the school that restrains anybody.
That's why I want,
Where a school employee uses a safety intervention, and let me use the exact, emergency safety intervention, is documented in the LEA's student file. In the LEA student information system and reported to the superintendent through the UTREC system. So let me just read that one more time and see if you're okay about that. Shall ensure that each school incident where a school employee, and then I have a question about that, uses a safety intervention, an emergency safety intervention, is documented in the LEA's student and then information system, and then continue on.
yeah, I
Is
think that spells it out real
does that say
specific
it
too,
better?
so yeah.
Okay.
That works.
So, I had a question about, and again, I'm not sure who, we've got so many people who are involved in this, I'm not sure the right person to ask, but it might be Jeff or Angie or Leah. It says, student information, let's see, it says, when I added school employee, does that include a volunteer?
Oh, that's a good point. It should, probably. Or,
I think school employee might define.
oh, let's look.
Let's see if it's defined in the rule. Thank you, Andrew. But we'll see.
Carol, I have a question.
Brittany, go ahead.
Oh,
Well,
it
we're
is.
looking for employee.
School employee is a defined term.
And it includes, hang on one sec, teacher, member, administrator, other person employed directly or indirectly by an LEA. So it should be an authorized volunteer.
Well, my question is if I understand correctly, only certain people are allowed to use this physical restraint. So physical restraint isn't just I'm restraining you, it's a specific trained method. So I don't think is there any cases where a volunteer would be trained and allowed, or a police officer?
Well,
Okay.
and let me say, this is,
Para-educator,
Okay.
to be a parent.
But
that
we
falls
have
under
those
the
questions from
employee.
law enforcement officers also, because sometimes if they're out of control, they'll call them and then they'll be the ones that can.
well, and let me point out, this is one of the concerns I had, and I asked Angie about this. I think this kind of blends the special ed emergency restraint issue with it doesn't necessarily, it's not limited to that. This could be an emergency restraint of a student that is not under IDEA. So I think it could be I think there could easily be a volunteer who, and I, granted, a long time ago I was at Kearns High School, but there were plenty of kids who, and I didn't have aides in the classroom at the time, but there are many kids whose arms I held down to their desks to stop them from throwing a pencil or hitting another kid or things like that. So I think that it's a blended situation, and you're going to have to, we either have to differentiate the IDEA issues from the 53G-8 physical restraint issues every single time, or we need to use separate words. I'm not sure. Go ahead, Brittany.
So I guess that's my question. Does this rule speak to just disciplinary action, or is this very specific to physical restraint? So there is both?
Well, the emergency safety intervention is the defined term that you're saying,
Okay.
but the rule actually talks
that-
about discipline in
but is that
general.
the
So I
idea?
guess I wasn't sure if you were talking about emergency safety interventions or the whole rule.
Well-
Okay, so this particular part that we're talking
Yeah.
about down here is specific to those trained incidents of physical restraint, not just, I'm trying to solve a disciplinary problem and may have touched a child in doing so, right?
But
And
it
so-
doesn't say, that's the problem. The emergency safety intervention definition
It's in
does
the-
not limit it to the IDEA
Physical
trained
restraint is.
individuals.
Or physical restraint as a term is a defined term, is that correct?
It is it's in the rule defined.
Correct, and so that,
Emergency safety intervention, look on line 37. Emergency Safety Intervention Committee, well, Emergency Safety Intervention, or ESI, means the use of exclusionary timeout or physical restraint when a student presents an immediate danger to self or others. As I read that, that doesn't say,
so physical restraint and emergency safety intervention are also defined terms, right? And so those terms would refer to what they mean, which is specific to those trained interventions.
but it doesn't say that in the emergency safety intervention definition. And if we mean it to be limited to those which are IDEA students, those, it's an IDEA related term, and I think the term should say that. You see what I'm saying? Leah, do you have anything to add? Physical restraint is defined in the code.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, I know.
It is.
I know.
Yeah.
But I guess, yes, physical restraint is a defined term, but I keep hearing trained. And the question is everybody trained that does it? I don't know. So are we only talking about that this applies if somebody has been trained, or is it a trained maneuver that sometimes people who are trained or aren't trained are using? Absolutely. Physical restraint is a defined term in statute. It's a defined term in rule. And I think Board Member Cummins, what you're stating is generally people who are using physical restraint should be trained. And it's a certain maneuver, not just holding an arm, right? Is
But
that
it
what-
doesn't say that, and I don't disagree. I just think if that's going to be, hang on one second, Andrew. I think if that's going to be our intent for this, then we need to say that emergency safety intervention, or ESI, is a term used under IDEA that means that a student,
Yeah.
This is the definition of physical restraint, right?
I get that.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrew, add to us, add to our thinking.
Two quick things. One is when the rule was drafted, the intent, and it may be different now, but the original intent of the rule was to apply to special ed and general ed students, so all students, not
Okay.
just,
Right.
not just special ed students. And then the second thing is that, I'm sorry,
Thank you, Mike.
I forgot that we were recording. I apologize for that. Do you want me to
No,
repeat the first
I
part?
think we're
Okay.
okay. Go ahead.
The second issue is that I believe that the language of the rule says that if physical restraint is to be used, it's to be used by somebody who's trained in its use.
We'll say that in the 53A definition. Thank you. We're trying to sync these two thoughts because that training is not required in the physical restraint language of 53G8.
No, because
We did that with Dave.
because it was all of that detail was included in the rule. And I believe that most of the the legislation just lays out the foundation and authorizes the board to create the implementing rule, which is what you're talking about now.
Trying to clean it up. Yes, thank you. Brittany?
So that leads to the question, because I wasn't part of this initial conversation, so I just have cobwebs of memories of full board discussion. Because it seems like it was described to me that you cannot, as a teacher, use your own form of physical restraint on a student, that if students are in danger, you clear a room rather than try and restrain a student unless you've been trained in this specific physical restraint. But that's my cobweb memory, and that's why I'm asking the questions. If that's not correct, then I wonder if this last part, these pages don't flip very fast in this new program. But if we, in the what line was that on? 309. Sorry, I went up. It's 309. So
Yeah, it's 309.
309. So if we were to take out school incidents, but just shall ensure that each incident at a school, so it's not the school using it, but incidents of these things occurring at a school, then it would take into place any SROs or law enforcement officers that might be present. But then I think it's still the question of making sure that we understand whether or not physical restraint is a defined term that requires training in order to perform it, or a physical restraint is just an action taken by an educator to restrain a child, which I don't think it is.
And the definition in 53G-8-302 also uses the word physical restraint.
Yeah, and the definition is actually in the section before, which I was there a second ago. So there's the definitions in 301. Do you want the definition or the
yeah,
provision?
but what I was going to point
There's
out,
the
yeah,
definition.
we've got the definition in the section before, but also there are additional reasons under 53G8. There's a different, sort of more flexibility or greater allowance for when physical restraint can be used. So it's not just limited to an emergency. Well, I guess all of these would be considered emergency, but not a technical emergency situation.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And my question isn't when it can be used, which I think is defined, but by who? Like who can?
Is training required, is what you're saying?
Yeah, that's my question, because that's what my memory tells me, but I don't know where that came from or where that accuracy is, and so I'm asking, like, who can give and perform physical?
Okay, so Angie, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to?
I don't know that I'm the best person to speak to it, but I also have that same recollection because Board Member Cummins, you may remember, and Board Member Hanson, me being bear hugged by Glenna Gallo at the time, multiple times.
Angie was waiting to give this example.
I was, yes, because I was
That's the special ed part of it, but that's not the whole ballgame.
No,
But that's actually, so your recollection is correct. So I don't know if Corby or Leah could speak more to this, and maybe, because I think we're all
We're
swimming. Yes.
Yes.
How to do it and was willing to practice it on Angie.
Yes. We did it multiple times in public. It was fun.
Okay, but I'm still trying to get this combination of the special ed situation and what the law allows, which is a little broader. But go ahead, add to this confusion.
Leah Voorhees, Assistant Superintendent of Student Support. Okay, this is not going to be particularly helpful, but I'm going to tell you what it actually says. Okay.
This is in the special ed rules?
So this is in the LRBI, which is incorporated by rule. Okay?
Reference
For
into the rule.
reference, incorporated by
Into the rule.
reference into the rule. Okay, so on page 13, which it references part 3 of the old version of 609. Okay, LEA policies shall include procedures for ongoing training of appropriate school personnel. So this is the part that I think actually is helpful to your point, and to your point, in crisis intervention training and emergency safety interventions. So the issue here was that yes, you have to have training, but not everybody has to have training. The appropriate personnel would have to have training. The ones who would likely, who might be, hopefully never, but might be using emergency safety interventions, of which we have restraint and seclusion. So training is required, but it's not required for everyone.
Okay. So it does take into account, I guess, what we're saying is we also have to account for both kinds. The kinds
Yes.
where training is required and the bear hug would then take place, but we also have to account for, and it sounds like literally account for by recording the incident, even if somebody was just restrained short of a bear hug. Does that seem accurate to both of you, or need I say that again? Both kinds of incidents need to be reported. The bear hug, which is the training, the MANT training essentially, isn't it? For certain kinds of employees. But then the other kind of incident where a student is restrained, also it sounds like needs to be reported, keeping in mind that you can also be restrained, and that's where I needed 50. Can you pull up 53A8 where it says, so there's the opportunities are a little broader.
I don't think.
Sorry. I need
That's
to
all right.
delete all of these
All
because
right.
I've
Right,
got a lot of
I
sections.
read it as
Hang on one second.
if you're not
There it is.
trained.
Okay, and you want the actual definition?
No, I was going to go to the next section where it says that,
The next section of code?
yeah, it just, or the 303 where it talks about when you can restrain a
Oh.
student.
Yeah,
Did I go too
Oh,
far?
no,
Did
yeah,
we
that
go
was
too far?
302.
so there's,
302.
there's no allowable and not,
So,
which is,
I could have this
if
on
you're
my
trained, you
computer
can
too,
do
I
it.
guess.
If you're not trained, you can't.
Where it says
Yeah.
that an employee may use reasonable and necessary physical restraint, so you have that term, again. In self-defense, we already understood that, or when otherwise appropriate in the class to the circumstances, to obtain the possession of a weapon or other dangerous object, protect a student or another individual from physical injury, remove from a situation a student who is violent, or protect property from being damaged when physical safety is at risk. So it's also okay, but sounds like it has
That's a
to be
defined
reported.
term. Physical
But it
restraint
has to
is
be
exact
reported.
same. It is the exact same term, too.
Yes.
It's word for
Yes.
word the same
I
as
would
what's in
agree.
our rule.
So we have to, so I think that, do you get what would be helpful then to clear this up, or no?
I think the intent was that, I'm sorry, do you care?
No, I don't care, I'm just,
So I think
Here.
the intent was.
yeah,
that-
you probably should
sorry.
use the mic.
Andrew and I were just kind of talking behind the scenes here. The intent was that it was only, we were talking only about physical restraint when you're given a bear hug, when you have the training, and that you couldn't do it unless you had the training, and that is what the intent was, right?
And this
But
section.
maybe it doesn't say that, but that was what our intent was, and not other kinds, because where do you draw the line? I mean, we talked about that extensively. Where do you draw the line about, is it this, is it,
Well,
you know what I mean?
This is and that is helpful, and I'm not so worried about what the intent then was, because it's now the intent of the board to make whatever changes are appropriate. So, it's helpful to know what you were thinking then, but I think they also need to now, as a committee, need to evaluate what we think is the right thing to do. And this is about reporting. So it sounds like what was intended to be reported, or what we want to be reported, is the emergency safety intervention as defined under IDEA, or as defined in the LRBI manual, which is incorporated by reference. And that's the one that has to be reported to the superintendent. So you don't have to report every other restraint that takes place, consistent with that other section of the code that we talked about. Brittany?
So did you just say that this rule does not apply to all physical restraint? So if a police officer comes in and restrains a young kid who's holding a knife, that would not be reported in this one?
Yes, I would say yes.
You would
Do we
say yes?
why?
Yes.
On lines 357 through 364, when an emergency safety intervention is used to protect a student or others from harm. And that doesn't say if it's a volunteer, if it's a police officer, if it's a school employee.
So it's the exact
A
language.
school
though.
shall immediately notify the student's parent, notify school administration, and provide documentation of the emergency safety intervention to their ESI. I guess that's the question too, is that they probably also would need to report it to us, but it's probably in another provision, but
When an emergency safety
That-
intervention is used to protect a student or others from harm, a school shall, the student, yeah, so I think,
yeah. And
remind me again, say your question again, Brittany, the
Okay.
first part.
So I think where you're reading is related to 309, lines 309 to 311. And I think some of the confusion was, is it a school using the emergency response, or is it an individual at the school using this intervention? And so could we just take out school using and correct the grammar to make that so that it's each school incident of this safety incident, and then I think it would match back down to where you were at before. Because this is LEA reporting to the state, the other one is
Right.
a school reporting to their LEA. Is that correct? Did I understand?
But both of them should be, we won't get the information to the state right if they aren't the exact same.
Correct.
They have to
Yep.
be the LEA reporting to, or the school reporting to the LEA, LEA reporting to the state. And then I think we've concluded, Angie, for your work, and Jeff, or whoever has to do this, that it is the physical restraint under 53G8 as well as the kind that was described under the LRBI.
I think they're the same.
Right. Well, except that the LRBI situation doesn't allow for those other reasons that are allowed for in state law, as I heard it. Am I mistaken?
The word appropriate, I think, is,
Can we?
And this says reasonable and necessary.
right. So, yeah,
So do we
We should use the
assume?
same words.
Do
we should use the same word.
Yeah. So do we assume that it's both kinds then?
I think we should assume that.
The definition of physical restraint is identical in the rule and in code, and I'm guessing it's the same in the LRBI
Well, the
manual,
way the
right?
LRBI starts, actually, it has this nice table of all the code and the rules. So it didn't like cut and paste.
But this has been updated.
Yes.
By the way, this whole section of the code was updated since the LRBI.
Which is why we're updating this now.
Yeah, it's Carol wants to
So was
know.
that first, rule
Yes.
second, statute third?
No, it was, yes. that's
Yes.
right.
Okay,
Yes.
and now we're waiting
Correct.
again for
So
that.
you'll update. So,
We will update this with your changes to the rule.
so whatever the intent was some time ago, it is now the intent that any kind of a physical restraint that will be reported. It still has to be, the physical restraint has to take place consistent with either IDEA, if it's and then the person has to be trained, or
section of
has
code.
to be consistent with 53G-8.
Yes.
Do that.
Now, to that, do we have any questions, Cindy?
Oh, well, just, I mean, I just heard some rumbling from someone in the hallway that lawmakers are talking about adding more times when physical restraint's appropriate. And I don't know what that code is going to turn up looking like, but it may change what happens in this board rule. But I have a question or concern about another line if we
Okay,
think we've
hold that thought
wrapped
for
this
one
one. Or
sec. I
okay,
know we've
I'll
just
hold
like
it. I'll hold it.
beat this to death, but, so is everybody comfortable with that, taking, that it's both kinds of physical restraint, and that the LRBI and the law and the rule will now be consistent? Okay? Okay, I think we're good. Okay, so Jenny was in the middle, but let's switch to Cindy for a minute, give you a break. What's your question?
My question has to do with line 360.
Okay,
And it's immediately notify the student's parent as opposed to or guardian as soon as possible and no later than the end of the school day. And Linda had mentioned, or Board Member Hanson had mentioned that we had some feedback from folks that immediately may be a little bit unrealistic. And having worked in schools, these situations don't happen often, but when they do, it's not like a one and done thing. It's not like I have to exercise some kind of a man restraint and then everything is taken care of. Oftentimes this is a all hands on deck. We're de-escalating a situation. It takes some time. So anyway, as far as the reporting goes and the timing goes, I'd like to see if Terry Shoemaker would be willing to come up and just share some, just to make sure we have input from a school perspective.
And just to keep it focused, your question is to the immediately.
Yes, and to the
Or-
reporting in general, yes. Just to
Okay.
get feedback on the reporting.
Okay.
Since
thanks.
that was some feedback that Board Member Hanson said we had received.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Terry Shoemaker with the Utah School Board Association, the Utah School Superintendents Association. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this a little bit. I had plenty in my head I could have talked about in the previous conversation, and if I disrupt a little bit back there, I apologize, okay? Let me tell you why. I'm going to give an answer. I'm going to answer that question by an incident that occurred when I was superintendent. The young man was 6'3", 225 pounds, disabled young man, put a teacher in the hospital, put an aide in the hospital, did it in separate incidences. So LRBI applies, special education rules apply, all of that apply. But the immediately part was, for me, I wanted to secure immediately the safety of my employees, the safety of the children in the school, the safety of the children nearby. At the time, I was also worried about we need to notify these parents, so you give directions to get things done as quickly as you possibly can. In that context, that was immediately. That was immediately. Now, there may be another incident where a child just gets out of control in the classroom, and the classroom has to be abandoned because he's throwing desks, chairs around, and the place is going crazy. The school has to, the classroom has to be vacated. These are real incidences, by the way, okay? So the immediately there is, we need to make sure, again, school, the safety of the children, the teachers, the employees, as well as the individual who's doing this is taking place at the same time. So immediately is going to be difficult. There will be people who interpret that as minute that started,
Yeah.
you didn't call me first.
So help us with immediately under the circumstances, within 24 hours? What
Well,
kind of
I'm
language-
not sure 24 hours is the right answer, okay?
Well, help us.
Under the
though.
circumstances, I think does fit better. I would be careful about
Or as soon as reasonably possible?
that's better too, because there are circumstances that you simply have to take care of a number of safety things first. You have to.
Yeah.
The parents, the employees, everybody expects you to worry about that first.
We're persuaded, Terry.
Yeah, so all I'm saying is, so we had this conversation with the superintendents.
Uh-huh.
And then the other question then is who? Who? Is it the school calls or is it law enforcement? We have districts right now
Wow.
where law enforcement makes the call when this restraint and these kinds of things occur.
Was law enforcement involved?
With, obviously with law enforcement
Okay.
involved, okay?
I agree with that. I like that.
Well,
But go ahead. Keep
But in
Keep
other
going.
cases, we have the school always called,
even
okay.
if law enforcement's involved.
even if law enforcement was involved. So we talked about both could be appropriate, but the language would have to be specific enough such that, it got done.
Yeah.
The worst thing in the world is nobody called.
Yeah, so it shouldn't just say
So,
either
yeah.
by school personnel or law
We had that
enforcement.
conversation. I don't have we did not come up with a definitive response, did we,
Okay.
Angie, during that conversation? We didn't. We discussed it, we kind of left it as it is, but I need to tell you that we have schools districts that it is their policy, and they train their employees that if law enforcement comes in and does this, they are going to make the call.
Well, and I feel strongly it should be, but I see what you mean about not wanting each to think the other is going to report,
Well, that-
so nobody reports.
And that doesn't work. So these are really very important conversations you're having because within any given school, at any given time, you could have an incident that, of this type that occurs, and the better we get at defining the policies and not be in a hurry about what that is. So I like the way Board Chair here, Lear, is doing this. Let's not be in a hurry. Let's make sure we get it right through discussion and how are we going to put these things together, because the special education law has to be part of this conversation, has to be part of it. And I gave an example at the beginning as to why it has to be part of it. At the same time, I had to protect the school.
Yeah.
Okay, on that particular incident. So you get how complicated this is. I'm just urging you. And then we have the whole notion of reform and reform procedures and criminal justice restoration pieces that are making a difference for kids in schools too. So we want to get it right as best we can. And so taking the time to discuss these things deeply is a very good idea.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments. So I think what we're left with is as soon as reasonably possible.
Thank you.
Is that?
Chair Lear?
Yes.
May I add one comment related to the word immediate?
Uh-huh.
So related to that specific word, the most frequent concern that we receive in our office, phone and email from parents,
Okay.
okay, the parent perspective, is that the parent didn't find out about it before the child made it home. And so the child told the parent about it, not the school.
And that's a fair complaint. Do you have a suggestion?
I completely agree with what the superintendent said. So I would just say consider adding that the school ensures that the notification is made before the student
Leaves the school.
is returned to the custody of the parents, because that is the most frequent concern we get about what you've been talking about from parents.
So it could be the two pieces. As soon as reasonably possible and before the student returns home or leaves the school's custody. Michael?
What if the parents aren't available? Do you
That's the
detain the
other-
child?
Well, that comes up, and we
does.
talk to LEAs about that frequently, that they've tried, but if they can document that they've
A good
tried,
faith
a
effort.
complaint investigator, a hearing officer is going to say, look, here's evidence. So,
So I wonder if it could be placed in the line above, a school shall, as soon as possible, and then still leave the immediately notify. So as soon as possible, immediately notify. Are you wanting to actually have something in there about
I think
a time
that's-
frame before they get home?
Shall
'Cause
immediately notify.
I think immediately and as
Immediately
soon
or
as
as soon
possible
as
are
possible
contradictory.
notify.
But, not contradictory, but it's hard to maybe satisfy both of them. But I think that the other two, we could have as soon as reasonably possible and Cindy.
Can we just add the word and attempt contact? So that if there's a problem and the person doesn't answer, then they can at least document, I called you at 3:55, or I left this voicemail at 3:55 before the student went home from school. If you just add the word in,
Well, how do you think that's going to resonate with parents who have that concern?
so they at least have to try before the student goes home.
I think if the rule states before the student goes home, I don't even know that you need to include the word attempt, because
I worry that they'll make a phone call and say, oh, it's not there.
I know, but with contact, I don't know.
Well, but I
try
also am
5
very
times.
sympathetic to the way Terry describes the situation.
Yeah.
So what's your druthers? Does anybody want to
I
make
can
a?
tell you what we were thinking.
Okay, perfect.
We were thinking of saying, shall notify a parent as soon as reasonably possible, but before the student leaves the school or something like that, or no late, so it says as soon as reasonably possible, but also. Yeah.
And is better than but or no? I don't know. I'll leave that
And
to you.
before, yeah. But that's the
That's just
concept.
fine, because you can notify by leaving a voicemail.
Mm-hmm.
Notify is better than contact.
Okay,
or-
that.
Yeah, it
feels
does say
good to
notify.
Leah,
Does that
feels good.
sound work?
Does that feel good to all of you?
And we'll work on the actual language,
Okay.
but that concept.
That's great.
of as soon as
Okay, next
possible.
week, we're only going to go till 3:00 on this, so we've got other items that take, so, yes. Oh, Andrew.
Just a question while we're on the subject of notification. and this may have changed in draft 2, so if it has, I apologize, but in draft 1, I noticed that that notification of a guardian is occasionally deleted in the text, and I was just wondering if that was an intentional, and if so, if there was a reason for
Yeah, I
the
can answer
deletion
that.
of
I
guardian.
think Angie can help us with that.
Yeah, since this rule was last, this rule was last revised, we have a definition section in R277100, and parent is defined as parent or legal guardian. So you don't need to repeat it every time. It's just assumed that when you say parent, it includes
Means
the legal
anybody.
guardian.
Does it say, for those of us who weren't aware of that?
It was a concern.
Does it say parent as defined, and so you can go back up and see that it includes guardian if you happen to be a guardian?
Well,
It doesn't, but it could.
the Rule 100, I'm trying to find, I pulled it up just a second ago
It
because
had-
I went to
Well,
look.
it does have the definitions, but I think he's saying, but so you would be assured of that, or so you could learn
Oh.
that from this rule, could we add that reference?
Well, it states in the rule that the purpose of this rule is to provide definitions that are used in the board rules beginning with R277. So everything in 100 applies to all of the rules that start with R277.
Right.
So
Are
that's,
you looking for more of a reference than that,
Now
or
that-
is this that?
Now that I know that, I'm okay with it, but because I did, because I
here's the
didn't
parent definition.
I didn't realize that the definition of parent now included guardian.
He's just saying
It was
people
confusing to see guardian deleted in it.
Yeah.
If I were reading it without knowing that, I'd be like, wait, I'm a guardian and this doesn't, and I don't get notified.
Okay, so we will see what we can do about adding that
So,
reference, even though I think this
Yeah.
happens throughout the rules. Thanks.
thank you for the answer, I appreciate it.
Cindy, do you have, or no, it wasn't Cindy, it was, oh, you don't have any more, and Jenny?
My only question is, has funding been, it says at the end that funding could be withheld.
Yeah,
Has funding been withheld?
no.
Do we know of any instances where funding, okay. I just
And in
wondered if-
fact, I had, while you're there then, I would say,
That was on line 396, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make sure that 396, if an LEA, this reads, if an LEA fails to comply with this rule, the superintendent may withhold funds in accordance with R277114. And then I wanted to add, following USB's technical assistance and model policies, so that
well, we should probably amend for 114.
so that we, 114.
Sorry.
No,
I'm
no.
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
Do you mean that in this instance, you want to say that this cannot happen until the
Yes.
model policies have been
I
created?
wanted to make sure, well, yeah, I wanted to make sure the USB does what it's supposed to do before it takes the draconian step of withholding funds. That's what I did want it to say. So,
Those literal words, draconian. Sorry.
the draconian and unwarranted.
No, I'm joking.
No,
We could
maybe
put
not.
something in there about.
But I think it just should say, following, because I don't think we can hold their feet, the LEA's feet to the fire until the USB's had done its role.
Sure.
Taken care of its role. So that-
I will say, I feel like we know we need to get the model policy done, like message received.
Sure.
And just the fact that we haven't done any corrective action,
Then
Right.
that's great.
Funding corrective
funding-
action.
Oh, thank you.
Because we do corrective action, and I was just going to ask to add that. We do corrective action through the IDEA dispute resolution process. So there are LEAs who have had corrective action related to this rule, but the mechanism to get to it has been through IDEA dispute resolution.
And I'm fine that we reference that separately, because that, and I, at least as one
This is
committee
about the
member.
funds, though, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
so
don't-
it's not about money, but
Right.
it has been corrective action.
So, is everybody okay with that? I mean, I'm not being, trying to be hard on the staff at all. I think that they have a tough job, but I also don't want to put the LEAs at a disadvantage because the USB has a hard job. That's my point.
Yeah, I can do that.
I just struggle with leaving small bits of words in rules that won't make sense to some future board that's like, what does it mean after model policy?
Well,
Anyway,
then we'll
because
just
we
say
know that that's
the
our
intent was.
intent. Well, okay. Anyways, I just think it's maybe an unnecessary appendix that doesn't need to be added just to give direction to say, before we
Okay,
take
just
any
so long
action.
as then, at least all of us will have the collective understanding, we're not going to withhold LEA monies until the USB has done its job. So
Policy.
just saved
Okay. Okay.
saved you from admitting you haven't done the policies yet, which is understandable. So I'm good with that too. I just want the collective understanding that when somebody is really soft on an LEA, it's because, wait, we didn't do our job first. Okay, anybody else have any? I have a few other questions, and I'll go pretty quickly through them because I said 3:00. So you guys are okay for a minute? Okay, line 108, where it talks about suspension. We had this discussion before, and Angie added the definition of suspension, which I appreciate on line 108. But it's still, and you're right, the pages are hard to turn. But it still leaves a couple of questions unanswered, because again, these are things that have to be reported. And my concern is that there's been inaccurate reporting of this for a long, long history. So it'd be nice if every LEA understood it consistently, and then we'd know that we had good data. So I just had some questions about when is suspension reported? Even in-school suspensions, and it does say that. So in or out of school, so in-school suspensions are supposed to be reported, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then for any length of time, what if a kid's suspended for one class period? What if you say go sit in the counselor's office? Should be reported too?
It says for any length of time.
Okay, I hope Terry's listening somewhere, so that it's for any length of time. He's not, but that's okay, we'll get back to him. You'll have this discussion with them. So it's for so they have to report every single one of these single period suspensions, in-school suspensions. Everybody okay with that? Oh.
No, you should be listening.
Well, that was a little rhetorical. AAG Buse, come forward. Or not. Thanks.
I question whether every time you put a child in a different environment, that is defined as a suspension. Because there will be times where a child might be having difficulty concentrating because they've got something ongoing with a peer. And so I'm going to go ask Mrs. So-and-so if you can do your work in that classroom. Is that a suspension?
So I don't know. Corby, do you know where we got this definition of suspension?
Well, it does say for a violation, while Corby's coming forward with thinking, for a violation of school policies or rules.
The child was misbehaving, so I'm going to have them for the rest of the
Oh, so
afternoon
is
do
that a
their work
suspension?
in the teacher's class
Yeah.
next door. Is that a suspension?
Well, I will just say this. We threw out a definition of suspension for your discussion purposes. As you can see, it's promoted discussion. So we are open. Jeff and I don't have, ideas independently of what the best definition of suspension is. So I don't know, Corby, if he got that definition from you, but we're definitely open to different suspension
I would
definitions.
prefer that it were a little more detailed, perhaps maybe even like the definition of in-school suspension for special ed, that they're not allowed access to the educational programming that goes with that day. But then there is in-school suspension where they take their schoolwork with them. So I'm saying from my past life working for a school district, I think that as broad as that rule is, it's really difficult to expect a school to know how to report.
Okay.
And,
And more than anything, I'd like consistency. So one secretary, but let's see what you can add. Go ahead.
Here, that one. They want to know whether a school should have to report every time of every portion of every day that a student is
suspended.
I think Michelle just accurately described what goes on. Because when I was a principal, we had in-school suspensions, we had out-of-school suspensions. The in-school suspensions were very effective for certain kids for certain purposes. They could have been a half a day, they could have been longer, they could have been 15 minutes. So should that also be reported every time? I don't think so.
Me too.
I think there's a great big difference between those types of reporting incidences versus, an out-of-school suspension, because it's much more serious. You will have some defiant kids who need those kinds of experiences. We're going to remove you from your peers, and we're going to put you over here for a little while, and that's going to work because you don't like that, and you're going to change your behavior. And that does happen. And it happens regularly in schools across the state. So is that the kind of thing we should report if it's for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 40 minutes or even for a half a day? I don't know. That's for you to decide. But I'm telling you, she's exactly right. The reporting of that's going to get messy if you're talking about those kinds of things, what we call in the business in-school suspensions versus out-of-school suspensions.
So if you guys are okay, go ahead, Leah.
I'm going to add two short things. The first is, IDEA and OSEP guidance and case law, because of OSEP guidance, it talks about suspension as removal from instruction. So to AAG Buse's point, if the student picks up his or her work, moves somewhere else, gets the services on his or her IEP, the special ed instruction, and the related services on his or her IEP, OSEP does not necessarily consider that a suspension. However, there's the number 2 point, and likely this language came from an OSEP guidance document, that if the student is removed for behavior, for the words you read, Angie, or that you read, Chair Lear, about going against the discipline policy, then that would be counted for purposes of manifestation determination, whether it's a series of removals, right? So the key, like when we're trying to help special ed directors and schools understand what a suspension is, the first question we always ask is, did the student receive the services on his or her IEP? If the answer is no, the kid was suspended. If the answer is yes, then we ask a secondary question. Okay, what was the student doing to be removed from the educational setting? Is that helpful?
It is. And so I think with that information, Terry's information, Michelle's information, these guys will come up with a better definition.
Wish us luck.
Yeah.
Can I make one other note?
Sure.
This conversation about what a suspension means, it could probably demonstrate to you why these policies, these rules never get done. Or we don't get the data from the LEAs, because everybody has a different definition of suspension, what they call suspension or an expulsion. I do think it's absolutely would be very valuable and critical to get a definition that everybody can agree to.
Agreed. Yes.
But just to understand, this is not just for, we need this definition for so many reasons.
Right.
So it's going to be a group effort. I think that you've given a good idea. We could do that two-pronged, that suspension means this or this. But we absolutely
there are secondary questions.
Yeah, and then we'll need some feedback on solutions or better definitions too. So we'll work on that.
So it's tedious and frustrating as this was.
be
I
great.
think that we're helping. I hope we're helping. Okay, thank you. My next question is on line 244. It's a similar kind of discussion, and Linda spoke to this a little bit. Well, more than a little bit, but a public education employee may not use physical restraint on a student for more than 30 minutes. That's what they heard, and why they decided that was this expert that reported to them, but that is not consistent necessarily with 53G-8- whatever that talks about physical restraint for various reasons that are justified. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, I
Angie?
can give you context. The rule was all rewritten and done, and then so this predated this, and at the time, the board and the legislature decided to only codify this portion of it. knowing that the rule was going to be more restrictive than the general, because this is more about the prohibition of corporal punishment, and that physical restraint is an exception to that. So I think at the time, the assumption was we're not going to talk about time limits in statute because we've got that in the rule. But if you think that because it's not in the statute that the board has overstepped in the rule, then maybe we need to put it into statute. But as you can imagine, these issues are very complex and often difficult to have these conversations with the legislature on the floor. So we could ask for some rulemaking and explicit rulemaking, but this rule actually was in place before the statute.
That does help. And I personally think having a point blank or an absolute statement like that is not very reasonable or smart, because I think if it's 31 minutes, if it's 35 minutes, if you're literally holding a kid who it's going to take a little while to get him to calm down and not tear up a book, then I don't like the fact that the person is violating this 30-minute time period. So, and that's my concern, but I don't know if I have a resolution. Brittany.
So I would imagine if it takes more than 30 minutes to de-escalate a student from tearing up a book or causing any harm, and I think it was what Board Member Hanson brought up earlier, there's a different intervention that needs to come, right? You don't just sit on a student for 30 minutes or restrain them for 30 minutes. I would think the only situation where more than 30 minutes would be applicable is if they're extremely violent and trying to harm someone. And if then maybe we just add 30 minutes or until law enforcement arrives or something like that, where I'm a teacher, I'm gonna hold this person until a law enforcement officer arrives. But I wouldn't think most other circumstances would take more than 30 minutes to de-escalate without trying a different intervention.
I think that's great. And that makes me feel a lot better. I just don't like the absolute of 30 minutes, no matter what. Do you have any thoughts, Michelle? Were you listening?
Yes, we were discussing. I think that it's almost another one of those where you have to have, if A or if B, there are always going to be circumstances that are going to make it so it's really difficult for you to find 30 minutes, 25 minutes, 40 minutes. It's going to depend on other factors.
It's 32
And so
minutes.
we might look at, other than just minutes, the context in which it's happening.
And Brittany gave a good, I thought that was a reasonable kind of an alternative. Andrew?
If I remember correctly, I believe the rule does say that if you seclude somebody, that they have to be actively observed while they're secluded. So there should be somebody paying attention to how long they've been in whatever circumstance they are currently in.
So add that piece too. Maybe, okay. Pardon? Oh,
Yeah, it's
okay.
in there.
Oh, good. Okay, I didn't notice. All right, we losing Angie?
I'm going to go finance.
Yeah, sure, Linda, go ahead.
So the part of the problem, like my first example, is that we had multiple parents come and talk about how their children had been left in those booths for hours and hours. And so that was one of the reasons that we felt like there had to be some kind of limit on the amount of time they could be in there, because they would just put them in and the teachers would get busy and they would just leave them in there. And they would just, I'll tell you my own experience. I walked into a school where I was the PTA president. I could hear the little guys screaming. So they hadn't forgotten about him. I could hear him screaming from the time I walked in the door. I walked down to the kindergarten room because my neighbor had a little boy with autism that was in that room, and I was afraid it might be him. So I walked down there and kind of stuck my head in the door, and she said, we've got somebody in this seclusion booth, and he wasn't in the room, so I knew it was probably him. I called his mom. She hadn't been notified. He'd already been in there for 3 hours. He'd soiled himself. It was a horrible, horrible thing. So that's some of the reason. And this, those weren't those weren't incidents that were rare. Those were kinds of things that were happening all the time. So we, and I think that having this rule in place has stopped some of that. It's made people more aware, so.
And my experience is I've heard isolated instance like that, but I haven't heard a lot of them. But I just don't like the idea of an absolute 30 minutes, but I don't mind the additional, I think adding the additional language makes me feel better. Cindy, did you have something?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think you can add additional language to it. I do think the 30 minutes at least helps in training purposes to send a message. I mean, in years and years of working in schools, I only had one situation that went longer than a 30 minutes, and it was an extreme situation. And I think in that case, you can certainly come and make an appeal and say, here's what happened, but you can add some language to the end of the 30 minutes, but it is nice to have, we're trying not to go beyond this. We're really trying hard to
And so you got that then? So, no, maybe not, or Jeff? Okay, so something that maybe modifies the 30 minutes to give a little bit of sort of lack of, I'm not great about absolute stuff. I had only just two more things.
Chair?
Yes.
Before we get past that 30-minute question, the line, sorry.
Go ahead.
On the line where it talks about the
Yeah.
30 minutes on 244, 245.
Right.
This is under this section that talks about seclusionary timeout and physical restraint.
Right.
But this line, it says may not use physical restraint on a student. It doesn't say anything about seclusion. Is that intentional?
And the physical restraint is the language from the statute.
No.
But
It's under the heading of seclusion, and Board Member Hanson was talking about incidents of seclusion. But this keys in only on physical restraint, and it doesn't exclude, but it doesn't include seclusion, unless I'm missing it somewhere.
Well,
I think seclusion is in a
Down a
it's
different section.
further down on
Yeah.
line 268. Yeah.
Well, just maybe to help with that, I asked Angie if maybe they could make it clear in the rule when they're referring to seclusionary circumstances versus when they're referring to physical restraint under 53G-8, even though sometimes the consequences or the conclusions will be the same. Because I think they're kind of different under IDEA than they are under the law.
Well, physical restraint can be both. And so my question is about, are we wanting a 30-minute time limit on seclusion? Because it doesn't seem to have it in the rule.
7, I'm sorry, as we
Yeah.
look down.
It's in
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, it does. It has so I think we're just going to let them.
Written weird, though.
I think we'll just let them. I hope that maybe by making it clear what this is, special ed discussion, this is, and then, but then which ones apply to both. So, those are all the things I had. Do you guys have anything else? I know we've just kind of beat this thing to death. So Jeff, between you and Angie, you've got enough information to go forward. Thank you. 3:00.
259.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Linda, for your background. Now we're moving to the next topic, which is, I missed one person. Before we absolutely, Joy Lynn, did you want to add anything else? You're sick of this too. Okay. Very good. Our next item is R277-306, Student Support License Area Preparation Programs. Travis, did Travis stay or go?
Assuming he's listening in his office.
Okay. Oh,
Here he comes.
here he is. He's here. Thanks, Leah. So we'll have Travis Rawlings explain this to us.
Good afternoon. My name is Travis Rawlings. I'm the Educator Licensing Coordinator for the State Board of Education. I apologize.
You are not a minute late was all. Go ahead.
Oh, good. Good. I felt so embarrassed yesterday that I wasn't. Anyway, okay, let's get into this. So this rule is the next step in our licensing revision process, and this particular rule is talking about the requirements for educator preparation programs for student support license areas. These areas, such as school social workers, speech language pathologist, audiology, they're very small fields, if you will. So one of the things that you may first notice, and I should mention, we put this out for public comment for a month. We've provided in the rationale, I provided you with a summary of the bulk of the feedback. I hope you've had a chance to read that, but I'll talk about it a little bit. But in general, one of the things that we took a different approach on this particular rule as opposed to others is that these are such small fields that it doesn't make sense to necessarily have full-blown Utah standards for each of these areas. So for example, you'll notice at the beginning, it talks about school psychologists and about the standards created by the National Association of School Psychologists. The number of school psychologists in Utah really doesn't justify the expense necessary to create our own standards, and so we're referencing those standards themselves instead. Now, one of the things we did learn from the past is we're not referencing the organization itself. So the board is not adopting whatever National Association of School Psychologists adopts, but rather the specific document that's listed in the rule. So for example, for school psychologists, this is the 2010 standards that they published. That way, if the National Association of School Psychologists changes their standards, the board can then re-examine to determine if they want to adopt those new standards or not. Which, by the way, that one is kind of old, and they are in the process of revising their standards. And when they finish, we'll bring it to the board and probably need to revise this rule, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. The only exception really in this particular rule to that is school counselors, which are at the end of the rule. School counselors, you'll notice, instead of saying that our programs must meet these national standards, you'll notice on line 102 that it says that our programs for counselors must align with those standards. So there are certain, it's not about having to be accredited by this organization, it's just about making sure that they're aligned with those standards because they are best practice in the field. So with that in mind, we've prepared this rule and similar to the other rules where we have detailed the general competencies that we are expecting our universities to prepare these individuals for before they start practice. Just like we did in 304, which was the teaching rule, if you will. One of I wanted to hit on the rationale, the two really big pieces of feedback that we got. So the first one is related to speech language pathology. So a number of years ago, this was actually when I first came to the board, this was around 2006, the board created a speech language technician license. This license was created by the board to certify that an individual can support the work of a speech language pathologist. And it had very specific definitions of the scope of their work and the qualifications that the individuals must have. Well, the national organization in this area, the Association of ASHA, I can't remember what it stands for, but they have a designation of speech language pathologist assistant. So when we first reviewed this rule, the question that arose is there a difference between these two things? Is speech language pathology assistant defined by this national organization different than speech language technician? And through the research and after getting feedback from the field, we determined that they are distinctly different. That the Utah definition is more stringent and allows more capability and more scope of work than the others. So we're recommending that we keep the speech language technician language and reference the Utah speech language technician handbook in that one. That was the first major point of feedback. The second one is a bit more heavy, if you will. It's a bit of discussion. This is in regards to the school social worker license area. And again, I'm not going to reiterate what's in the rationale, but I just wanted to kind of share with everyone what the general idea is. The biggest issue is school social licensing excuse me, school social worker licenses, from all the research that I have been able to do, from all the things the sources I've been able to find, I can see no reason for that license to exist. There is essentially no preparation difference between a school social worker and a social worker. The DOPL, the Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing for Utah, already licenses social workers. They have a very rigorous method and standard. School social worker is no different from what I can tell from all the research I've done. And so there are other professions that are licensed by DOPL that work in schools that don't have educator licenses. Nurses, physical therapists. This is always a big issue for the Utah School for the Deaf and Blind. I mean, Superintendent Coleman has talked about this before. But ultimately, there are consequences to this choice. So staff's recommendation is to discontinue these licenses, to say this is a license that should no longer exist. But as I put in the rationale, there are some very serious consequences to that. There are certain funding sources that are dependent and utilize and provide funding to districts and charter schools for school social workers. And so this isn't something we've taken lightly, but it's something that we believe as staff is in the best interest moving forward in this area. Other than that, I think you'll find most of the rule is pretty straightforward and comparable to the other licensing revision rules. But with that, Madam Chair, that's my presentation. I'm entertaining any questions you have.
Thanks, Travis. Anybody have any questions or comments about the rule or that Travis can address? Brittany?
Just making sure I understood you correctly. So up to this point, we've offered a license for certain places, right? And so you're saying there are some pros and cons to not offering a license, but the one catch, is the only one catch the funding?
As far as I've been able to determine, and I'm certainly not, I don't know everything, that's the only one I've been able to identify.
Can I ask a couple follow-up questions?
Oh, please.
And so is it just because of the way the statute is written that it's specific to a licensed educator in order to get that funding? Is there something we can do to ask the legislator? Would it be easier to ask the legislature to fix the statute rather than create all these licensing areas that are unnecessary?
So I think that's a very important piece of it, and that's why that recommendation is in the rationale, that we recommend that you direct staff to work on some of those things, because ultimately we're not happy about the idea that Granite School District is going to lose $300,000. That's a lot of money.
And lose it from feds?
From the
state funding?
State funding, the legislative salary adjustment for
Oh, that's
66
right.
educators.
Oh, that's right.
That's $300,000. And so we're not taking that lightly, but what we want to do is go back to the legislature and say, should these people be generating funds, yes or no? And if they should, then we should be partnering with DOPL to try to kind of communicate on, making sure, well, they're licensed, right? So we should give them this funding. But that would require a change in statute, absolutely.
Okay. Just one last question then. So sort of related to that is one of the other things that we use a license for is the permission to be in a classroom, right? And so is there any difference between something that would exclude one of these professions from performing their profession and what we require in order for an educator to be performing their profession around children?
That's a very good question, and I think that if we go back a number of years, that may have been an issue. But as the current statute talks about background checks for volunteers, for third-party contractors, for all of these individuals that are employed in schools, it should not be an issue. And especially because now we think about it, these are no different than the nurses working in our schools. The nurses don't have a background check through us, but the LEAs are required to background check them. So LEAs would simply be required to background check these employees.
As employees.
Yeah.
Have were you through, Brittany? And hang on, come sit. up here, but I just had one question that's very related. So have social workers been in Cactus previously and now they would not?
So the intention is, well, school social workers have been in Cactus as far back as the 1990s, as far as I can tell.
If they're licensed
If they're licensed educators.
Educators.
Yes,
But they wouldn't be in Cactus just as a licensed social worker?
correct. That is correct.
Okay, so it really doesn't change anything there?
Except that what the change would do is all those that are currently in the educator license for school social, we would remove those licenses. They would no longer
If
exist.
they were, you wouldn't move them, or would you move them if they're licensed educators as social workers and English teachers? I mean, they'd still be in there.
Yeah, they'd still be in there as an English teacher,
It's
yes.
just because they don't have their educator license if they only have the educator license because of their social work status.
Correct.
You'd remove them.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's where I need to speak.
Oh, please.
Because that is an effective revocation. And you would have to treat those who already have their social work license as being grandfathered in, because you're taking away their certification,
interest.
professional license to practice their profession without due process. And so I've been researching the case law, and there's some problem with that. And so you would have to look at how do I do that? If I'm simply increasing the requirements of the individual, because there are some increased requirements. It's ironic that this came forward because I was asked by the school counseling people to make a matrix of what the qualifications are for all of the different mental health professions. So there's a little bit of a difference. The school social worker has to have a master's degree and serve an internship in a school. But a licensed clinical social worker has to do 4,000 hours of supervised mental health therapy, which is defined under the statute. And they have to take an exam through DOPL. So you would, I don't know how long an internship in a school is. So I can't compare whether that internship in a school is equivalent to 4,000 hours of supervised mental health services.
But so just let me make.
So I would be increasing the requirement to say to a school, a licensed school social worker, you're no longer eligible to practice your profession unless you meet the requirements that DOPL has for an LCSW or a CSW.
Which are considerably different, maybe.
No, you do not have to have a DOPL license to be a school social worker. They're different practices, and if you read the scope of practice, a school social worker is focused around the student's achievement in school, the impact and the barriers that are affecting their achievement in school, versus a licensed clinical social worker has a whole different list of their scope of practice. So their education, they both have to have a master's. I can't tell you whether it's an increase between internship with no identification of hours and 4,000 hours of supervised practice. And then DOPL requires them to take an exam, which USBE does not.
So you're saying that
if you just eliminate it and say, okay, you 150 people, I'm going to take away your license because I changed the rule, you're going to subject the board to constitutional challenges for effectively taking away their property interest without due process. So just
maybe
keep that
it's
in
more
mind,
complicated.
that you could still, this is the preparation program. And you have the right to say, at this point in time, if in the future we're going to change things, we're no longer going to authorize school social worker preparation programs. That is not a problem. What you have to do is consider, how do I grandfather or work my way out of the licenses that currently individuals have achieved all of the requirements that you set. I can't make a law that retroactively goes back and takes away something that I gave to them legitimately, that they met those requirements.
Which sounds like it's a little, your information is a little different than what Travis has found. So hold that thought. Let me see what Cindy has to say. And just stay there, if you will. And Cindy, did you have?
Just a question. Are we defining this? Who's defining school social work preparation programs versus requirements for LCSWs?
The requirements for LCSW is in state statute and rule. And you can find those, I have them on my computer, but DOPL, you can go to DOPL and find them. The ones for school social worker are in the other rule that's currently in there, and it's not about preparation programs.
Board rule?
Our
It's
board
506.
rule for school social worker, it's like in the 500s.
506 is what it is.
506. And so it talks about it, and then when you look in the different approved programs, the approved programs will tell you this is the focus of their practice. So based on that, there's,
But we would repeal 506, I'm thinking, or you'd
So-
suggest that, or you propose that.
Yeah, that would be the proposal. I mean, one of the things that we're getting into, and again, I'm glad Michelle's bringing these things up because, part of it's implementation, part of it's intent, and all those issues. But ultimately, when the only phone calls I get are LCSWs wanting to become school social workers, and then when I look at the requirements, obviously I didn't look closely at the intern, but there's no difference. So we have this kind of way for them to get around the rules, and to make it work. But it always seems so hodgepodge. It's not about people in a school social worker not working elsewhere. When I work with the universities, so BYU has a social worker program. When we talked about having to do accreditation, back in 2012, and the board reviewing and approving programs, BYU decided to drop the school social worker and just go with social worker because that's what candidates take. When I talk with, I believe the only one in Utah right now is University of Utah that prepares school social workers, it's the same program as far as I can tell. So ultimately, what Michelle is saying is absolutely correct. We'll need to be careful on the implementation, but I think overall, the long-term goal should be to discontinue these licenses, in my opinion.
Which, I have a thought about that, but Cindy, did you have more? Does that help, or no, or you don't know, or?
Well, two things. One, to Travis's point, with that BYU program, I mean, they kicked out, when I was a principal, like 7 interns a year to do any types of interns. But I always begged and I always got one, and they did fine in the school without having a necessarily specific school type of license. My only question about this is there going to be some kind of pipeline issue? The phone calls that you receive seem to indicate otherwise, that the LCSWs are the ones interested in being school social workers, but it seems like the requirements to be a school social worker are fewer than an LCSW. And so will there at some point become a pipeline issue where we could have these folks who are focused on doing social work in a school without those extra requirements?
The more extensive preparation.
Yeah, that's my question.
I think that's a good question. One of the things I didn't put in the rationale is one of the things that we've been noticing over the past spring in regards to the TSSA money that came out of the legislative session recently. I've had phone calls from districts and charters that are interested in using that money and wanting to do it, like Michelle mentioned, for mental health counselor versus school social work and school counselor. And, they've been calling me and asking me, well, if we decide to go with a mental health counselor, do we put them in Cactus, for example? Do they have to have a license? The answer is no, because we don't license that area. But if they choose school social worker, then they do. And so it's kind of weird that way. And so the fact that BYU, like you said, just had it shut that down. The University of Utah puts a handful throughout every year. What we're talking about, and this is in the rationale, is 170 positions in the state of Utah out of 36,000 educators. It's a pretty small percentage of what we're talking about. So, anyway.
Could I?
Michelle.
I don't think there will be a pipeline issue if we do it the way that Travis is saying, by first letting the preparation program know that we're not going to do that school-specific one anymore, that LCSWs are really overqualified for the position, but that they don't get the $4,200 extra in their wage through a school district because they don't have the school in front of their social work. So if you took care of eliminating the preparation program, and just grandfathering those that already have their license through, and maybe even encouraging them, saying, I know that these are increased requirements, and we're not going to take away your ability to get your school social work. You know, I get that, but you might benefit from completing the requirements of the LCSW and taking your exam. I don't think the pipeline thing will be a problem.
Let me hear, we had someone signed up for public comment, and then while we're doing that, let's kind of process what we want to do about this. I have one idea, but I'd like to hear yours. Mr. Zenger from Granite School District, Todd Zenger, board member.
I'm here wearing one particular hat, and I've been asked to wear a third. I'm here wearing two hats and been asked to wear a third. I am a member of the Granite School Board. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of the Utah School Board Association, and Terry Shoemaker represents us in a lot of matters, but he's asked me to make a few comments. I think the points that Michelle has made are right, and I'm not going to go into those, but we are concerned that our employees' ability to practice as they've relied upon over all these years under a direction that this board took or that the state took, requiring this. I asked myself this question: if there's no difference between a licensed social worker and a school social worker, why did we make that distinction at some point in time? My point is, some of our employees have relied upon that, and it would be unjust and I think inequitable to just yank that from them without some reasonable sunset for them to finish out their career, or for those people in the pipeline to meet those qualifications and have that benefit. But the additional point that I want to make, in addition to what Michelle made, was the school districts have relied upon that also. And in so doing, we have a differentiation in our pay schedules. And so while that might represent $250,000 or $300,000 to Granite School District, you also have school districts like Canyons and Provost that have similar issues, and all of a sudden this is $1 million a year. And how is this going to sunset? We can't sunset this in 1 year or 2 years, because we might have people who've relied upon this for the last 5 or 10 years, hoping to have a career for the next 10 or 20 years, so that whatever sunset provision might be formulated would have to take into account not only the license and the ability of our employees to continue to practice what they've qualified themselves to do and understood was going to be a career path for them, but also the cost to the school districts. And $250,000 times 10 years or 20 years is all of a sudden, $2.5 million or $5 million to us over time, and that's a lot. And so from that standpoint, it is a substantial hit, and I appreciate what you said, Travis, right? Travis indicated that they were sensitive to this, but it just can't be something that we're announcing in 2 years we're not going to do this anymore, because that impact is going to go for years or decades in the school districts.
But to make sure I understand, but if these employees were to have that designation until they leave, I mean, everybody currently now in the pipeline's another question, so hold that thought. But everybody currently in the schools and under that designation would be able to keep that designation forever. They'd all be grandfathered in. That would address your problem?
Well, partially, yes, because that would be their professional expectation, but the economic expectation is, because of that distinction, they are being paid differently, because their qualifications are different, because their skills are different, there's a different pay schedule, and we've been relying upon the state to make up that difference for us.
Which could all stay in place as long as those people were in the system, could it not, Travis?
It theoretically, yes, but the problem would be moving forward, as he mentioned. It would be problematic if my pay schedules said social workers make this much, and this old person generates this money, and this new person doesn't. It is a problem with negotiations and pay schedules. Absolutely, absolutely.
The point that I would make on that is just give people notice, like Michelle said.
Yeah.
Notify people going forward. There's a new game.
Okay.
So everybody entering the system, there's a new game. Then I think we're okay because everybody's on notice that this distinction is going to go away.
Okay. Thank you. That's a good point. Michelle?
And that the pay difference that is given in the statutes for the school social worker could statutorily be changed to school social worker or licensed clinical
Yeah.
social worker. Then in negotiations, the same supplement that came for a school social worker would qualify for a licensed clinical social worker. Then a district would be held harmless, or an LEA would be held
Okay.
harmless.
So we could solve it that way, too.
Okay.
So, Brittany, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so just for clarification, we're talking about the money in the TSS
P.
something account?
Salary adjustment.
Oh,
So that's
salary
the
adjustment.
teacher, so that's what I said,
TSSA
there's two
Two.
different pockets of money, right? There's the teacher salary adjustment, and then there's the pocket of money that can be used for mental health
Right.
professionals, school counselors, et cetera. But we're talking about the are you specifically talking about the loss to the LEA if that school social worker is no longer an educator and you can't pull down that extra educator funding from the state? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
So my question then is, as we move forward, and I know there's no guarantee that the legislature would be willing to move forward, can we look at this in theory and ask for a legislative change? And if that doesn't change, then we go back to this idea of designating them as educators? Because it seems odd, because we already have this funding source that's used, and it's very transparent that it's used for these things, to just cut it out because of a definition. And so is there a way to move through this process so that that funding isn't lost, but that the legislature is clear that we would like to use this funding for all of these professionals who are in our buildings, but we don't want to designate them as an educator anymore because they're already a professional in their own realm of profession?
So, Travis?
Madam Chair, may I make a recommendation?
Yes.
So what I would recommend is, as Michelle stated, if you were to pass forward this rule as written, all it does is remove the preparation programs for school social workers. We also know we are going to have to revisit, 301 and everything. When we get to the end of this, we need to, align everything and kind of tidy things up. I would recommend that if it's what you would like to do, that you could direct staff to, in those corrections, include terminology and phraseology to ensure a gradual transition out of this license, and then we would then have to present that to you as a board when we come back to those rules. I'm thinking 301, by the way, is the one I'm thinking.
So you're thinking we could pass this because it's about a preparation program, and then have you clean up the grandfathering issue, the in the pipeline issue?
In the 301 rule,
In
yes.
301. Going in the future.
That, of course, is assuming that you do want to discontinue this distinction.
I see that.
Right.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And let me just ask one last question, and then I think we'll take a motion because we've got one more topic that we need to discuss. It's just not an action item. So this does mean, however, that previously, if social workers misbehaved, there would be a professional practice report and then investigation. And now, if they're not in Cactus, except for those that are grandfathered in, they would be disciplined by their employer, and that would be the end of it. So that is another.
Well, not necessarily just there.
Oh, well, or DOPL.
Or DOPL, which Ben can provide you with an
Bring
example
me
of that
on.
if you'd like.
Bring me on. Bring DOPL on. Let him. I love it. I wish everybody was under DOPL. Michelle, that's good. Okay, so that is it. But just to be in full disclosure, that is another consequence. So, does anybody have a motion, Brittany? Or
I have one question before the motion. Is if this motion passes, is another motion appropriate to request from the committee a legislative ask to look at that teacher salary supplement legislation to include non-educator licensed professionals who are serving students in schools?
I think so. Go ahead, Michelle.
I just based on the last legislative session, I think that legislators would be open to that because their original, in the TSSA, they had language that said school social worker or social worker, nurse or school nurse. And they named both of them and recognized that there were different levels of licensing. So based on that, I don't think it would be a difficult proposal to provide to legislators and request that they give that to both of them in the same manner.
Is it okay to make that same motion in one? I'm not sure I have anybody here to ask who has any authority. We'll just can make the same motion for one, for both purposes. Do you want to go ahead and make that motion?
I move that we approve, sorry, I might be lost, so tell me if I'm wrong. We approve R277306 Draft 2 on first reading and recommend to the board for approval on second and final reading with the following, maybe it's a separate motion. With, what was that? Okay.
They just go with it. Yeah, that end there.
Okay. So that's the first motion.
Okay.
Then there's-
The motion is that, Cindy, did you have any discussion of that motion?
No, I just want to make sure the provisions go through before I vote on the motion for this.
Oh,
Switch the
You got to do the order.
yeah,
Switch
so
the
let's
order.
maybe start with the other motion.
Okay, so I move that as future rules are brought forward, so this is just a committee motion, that as future rules are brought forward, that with the understanding that educators who are currently under the school social worker license would be grandfathered in to this process. Does that capture?
Yeah. So the motion is that current license holders of social work type license would then be grandfathered in. Well, and yes, and we're going to have to add students in the pipeline, and that's a little trickier to figure out, but
I can do it.
both those who are currently licensed as school social workers and those in the pipeline would be dealt with, and there would be a request for a legislative change to make that so.
Did you get that?
So yes. And so that's the motion. All in favor of the motion? Aye. And anybody opposed? Great. And now the second motion is?
So the second motion is that I move that the committee request that the full board add on the legislative ask, that the legislature consider modifying the teacher salary supplement legislation to incorporate the idea of having non-educator licensed professionals that are licensed outside to be able to receive the teacher salary supplement.
So the motion is that the, oh, I'm sorry, Sarah, so sorry I missed you. Yeah, so discussion to that motion.
Thank you, Sarah
The wrong
Jones
one.
with UEA.
Teacher salary
I just wanted to ask a question because this is kind of going in a different direction. So is the intent to have that $4,200 with the money plus benefits is $5,500 approximately, just for the LCSWs that would be coming in and working in a school setting? Or are you saying we want the legislature to do that money for nurses, OTs, PTs, all these categories, and what would be the estimated cost of this? So that might be something for you to,
Yeah.
because if you start adding just LCSWs, then why not OTs? Why
Yeah.
not PTs? Why not audiologists or the other categories? So kind of give that your consideration. Thanks.
I'm seeing a bunch of blank looks. Cindy?
Well, I just want to make sure
Thanks,
we're talking
Sarah.
about the right
Good
account.
thought. Good catch.
Doesn't that account only apply to STEM and special ed? Am I thinking of a different teacher supplement program?
Madam Chair, may I?
Travis?
So
We've
this
got
is the
like
problem with too many
3 minutes.
acronyms, right? Because the one was
Short
TSSA, legislative salary adjustment is LSA, and teacher salary supplement program, that's the one you're thinking of with math and science. So that's actually a completely separate one.
Yeah.
So this particular one is the $4,200 paid to a specific subset of licensed educators. So superintendents don't get it. But principals get half of it, and teachers get all of it. It was created in 2008 is what we're talking about.
Could I suggest that we limit it to language of where school social workers receive where any funding is tied to school social workers, that we add LCSWs with that? That was my intent, was that in those areas like in 53E630 or 53F5209 that grants things for a school social worker, I only intended to make whole the district in those specific instances where it named the school social worker license.
Yes.
Okay.
That
And without objection, we will modify that previous motion to that intent. Is that okay? Yes. Okay, without objection. Okay. And then we're going to let those other people fight their own battles to be included. Go ahead, Travis.
I was going to add just that. So
Okay. And they may successfully do that.
Yep.
Because I think you're right. It creates a disparity that's hard to justify, but that's where we are with money. Money's about that. Okay, so we were about to have the second motion, which was
to basically, we recommend to the board that we add a legislative ask to match Michelle's recommendation.
Okay, so the motion is that the Law and Licensing Committee recommends to the board a request to for the board to make and then the legislature to receive a request that would make LCSWs, or that would make the category formerly known as school social workers eligible for the teacher salary supplement. Does that capture it? No, not quite. Go ahead.
So I think just being very specific to what Michelle just said, that where it speaks to school social worker, that also equate to licensed. Yes.
So it is specific to licensed LCSWs would equate to licensed school social workers for purposes of TSA.
Just funding.
Just for funding? Okay, so let me try it, just to be somewhat accurate for the record. So that for purposes of school funding, then clinical licensed social workers would then, no, not quite.
Maybe we just need to.
That's all right, go ahead. We better get it right.
I would recommend that you utilize the language social workers licensed through DOPL because they actually have different types of license. Like LCSW is one of them.
That's,
So I would recommend licensed as a social worker through DOPL.
is that okay, Brittany? Okay, so the motion is that there would be school funding for those social workers licensed through DOPL that would be comparable to former school social workers.
I like it.
You got that? Is that okay? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No. Thank you. So there you go.
One more motion.
Go ahead.
The last motion is to approve our 277472 draft 4 on.
306
draft 2.
Sorry,
That's right.
I was cheating on the wrong document. Sorry, what is the rule number? 304?
306.
306, sorry, R277306, draft 2 on first reading and send to the board for approval on second and final reading.
So the motion is for the committee to approve R277-306 draft 2 on first reading and recommend to the board for approval on second and final reading. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No. Okay, and there's no one opposed. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Travis. That was really patient. Thank you, Michelle, for your input. That was helpful, too. So the last thing, we've got 20 minutes to talk about. Oh, no. Oh, okay. The proposal about R277472 was that we wait until next month to discuss it, because Cindy had some strong feelings that she wanted to try and have some discussion with some community members some charter school folks about that. Is that incorrect?
No, we had put it on for today, but I had met with Jennifer and she suggested that I meet with charter school directors, and then that meeting was canceled in the summer, and it's going to be Monday. So
Okay.
I'll meet with them on Monday and gather feedback, and then if we can discuss this again
Great.
in October, that'd be great.
So the motion is to then table R2, not table, just skip over. Refer for discussion in October, R277-472. All in favor of that? Aye. And nobody's opposed, right? Okay, thank you.
Can I ask?
Now
can I-
we have one last, oh, you
I'm
are
sorry.
opposed.
I'm not
That's all
really
right.
opposed. Can you help me remember the dialogue of what the discussion was that was going to take place so I can?
Sure.
It was, there's a transfer date of June 30th in the code, and I had suggested March, and Jennifer had gone back and talked to the State Charter School
That's
Board,
right.
and they suggested April 15th, but then she wanted me, said after that, maybe you should just talk to the directors and see if there's any unintended consequences, so that's what I plan to do on Monday.
Okay, that's right. I'd forgotten that.
Is that, oh, good? Okay. Now we move to our last item, 5.5, and this is just an information item. We'll discuss it until 4 o'clock straight up. This is the issue of third-party provider contracted services. And Debbie Davis, is she still around? There you are. Thank you. Debbie was going to kind of present what we're thinking about and ask, and then we can ask questions. We don't have a need to reach a decision today. This is just if we want to have further discussion. So go ahead, Director Davis.
All right, so Chief Audit Executive Debbie Davis. So this item comes from the Audit Committee, and at first blush, it will seem very similar to topics that have come to this committee and the board before. But to make sure we're all on the same page and to maybe just make sure we can have an open discussion, maybe set aside what you think this is maybe going to be. It is not related to those previous discussions. There were very niche things that we had talked about before, and this is a very broad item. And so maybe to set the table even a little bit more, it has to do with the board has objectives, right? Those are outlined in your strategic plan, and the superintendent was very eloquent in talking about those yesterday. Those are our objectives for our students, for them to have these awesome lives and be successful and have opportunities. When we have objectives, there can be things that come up that get in the way of us achieving those objectives, and those are risks. And the definition from the Institute of Internal Auditors on risk is just an event that might possibly occur that will impact the achievement of objectives. And you noticed it didn't say negatively impact or positively impact, it just says impact achievement of objectives. And I think in the case of this specific risk that we're going to bring up, there is both positive and negative. I think positive in that contracted services, looking for external providers is kind of the way of the future, outsourcing a little bit. There's innovation that can happen there. There are companies that can do things that they can do it for cheaper, they can do it better. So that's an opportunity. It's exciting, and education can partake of that. So that's a positive opportunity, a positive side of risk. On the other hand, as we pursue those opportunities, there could be liabilities as well. And we want to make sure, especially where we're using taxpayer funds and where our students and educators are part of the system, and we want to take care of them, that we're stepping carefully and that we're mitigating liability. So that's what this item is about. And in the supporting documentation, you'll see, and I crafted this language very carefully because we could say third-party provider, we could say contractor, but I settled on the federal language, and we get federal grants, so I figured it was okay to settle on the federal language. But the risk is LEAs who enter agreements with external entities for services. And actually, in a conversation earlier today, it's not just LEAs, it's the state board as well. We contract for external services, so some of these risks apply here to us as well. But in considering when we enter into these agreements, what risks are there, both positive and negative, the opportunities and the liabilities. And so looking below, we've listed several questions that this committee could consider. We presented these to the audit committee, and they thought a public discussion about some of these questions would be prudent to just determine if there are policy actions that the board might want to take. So I don't know how much detail we need to go into these questions, but you'll see just the overarching question on that page is, what services are and should be provided by the public education system, and of these services, which could appropriately and effectively be provided by an external provider. So it's kind of wide open, and again, there are sub-questions below that get really specific in talking about things that we should consider if we're going to enter into these contracts, again, to mitigate that liability, but take advantage of the opportunities that we have as well. So I can go through each of these questions, or do you have questions about the questions? What would you like to do?
Yeah, and part of the discussion was supposed to be, do we want to pursue these concerns and and this question as suggested to us by the audit committee? That sounds like a yes/no question, but it's really a more question for discussion in the next 15 minutes. So let's start with questions for Debbie, Auditor Davis. Anybody have any questions for Debbie? Jenny, is that you?
I don't know if I have questions.
You're not sure either.
I guess I'm trying to understand the wading through this. I feel like we waded through this earlier, and I know you're saying this is different, so I'm trying to wrap my mind around it, because what you just explained almost sounds like we're wading through the same thing again, but maybe I'm not fully understanding, so I'm trying to understand that. Plus, I feel like we're also going to wade through this with the charter task force, it sounds like. So I just wonder where our time's best spent, but I don't know. And we also just did these policies too. So anyways, I guess we'll just see where the discussion goes. I just don't, I mean, for use of our time, I just wonder if we're really, I don't know. All right, there you go.
Other comments? Other feelings?
No, I just
go ahead.
Like Debbie to review the questions and what came up in the audit committee and what the audit committee board members asked us to consider.
Okay. And we don't have to answer them today. These are just the questions you're proposing for thoughts and discussions and.
Sure.
Right. Okay. And you want to be, is it the kind of thing that we'll have questions about? I didn't particularly have any questions. I just was wanting to hear what you wanted to say. Do you, if you have questions while she's going through this, please raise your hand. Go ahead.
Yep. Stop me if I'm talking too fast or if you have a question. Either of those is great. And maybe to back up for a second, we're identifying risk. Internal audit is kind of strategically placed where we talk to a lot of people, we see a lot of data, we look at regulations, and so sometimes we put all those pieces together and it's like, that seems like maybe it's a significant risk, we should talk about it and maybe assess it further. And that's what happened with school fees. So this was kind of another one of these items where we're looking at, we've had a school closure, we have different monitoring going on, we have internal and external audits, we've seen some different data, and so looking at that's what prompted some of these questions. And you're absolutely right that there is a little bit of overlap with the charter school task force. Maybe a difference being that there are questions here that absolutely apply to our districts as well, that the charter school task force might not look at. And also you'll notice this isn't tied to one specific board rule. There are probably several that apply, where in the past we have been looking very niche at just one rule, maybe 417. So I'd say this definitely is broader. But I will jump into some of the questions. And the first one is, when we're setting up agreements, are we accurately, do LEAs, or do we even accurately designate external entities as subrecipients or contractors? And maybe those are new terms for you, but it's actually a very important distinction. The feds have they believe it's a very important distinction. It's included in federal regulation, and I've included the definitions there. But a subrecipient, essentially the state is a primary recipient, and all of our LEAs are subrecipients, which means they're making programmatic decisions, they're determining eligibility, we pass money through to them, they have to obey the same laws and rules that we do. And so the oversight there, the risk, because they're so involved with providing the actual programs, is very significant. So we have a significant oversight responsibility. In contrast, you may have a contractor who's just providing a good or a service. Someone that comes in and shovels our walks or provides landscaping or our copy machine services. Those are your contractors, and there's a very different level of oversight that's needed when you have a contractor versus a subrecipient.
So then that gets into my question of is, so you're talking about lawn care and kind of some of those physical facilities, but also bookkeeping, would that be considered a contract, correct? Not a subrecipient? Or when would you draw that line between subrecipient? Are you talking about federal funds, grant funds that have specific lines tied to them? Or can it apply to state grants, et cetera? When would you draw that line between a subrecipient and a contractor?
And a contractor. So the federal government obviously has outlined those definitions, and we have to consider them with each federal grant that we have.
Just to be clear, are there, so are there criteria that define
Yes.
subrecipient and
Yes.
other criteria that define contractor?
Yes, and the federal guidance actually says we are required to designate. And I was actually, one or the other. We need to be designating that because that drives the kind of monitoring that we do and the kind of monitoring that we, the oversight that we provide. So that's a requirement for us.
Okay, I
and
don't
for
want
others.
to hijack. Was that the question you were asking?
So to go just one step further, because correct me if I'm wrong, but all the federal money I'm aware of comes through a grant of some kind. Whereas state funds flow differently. Some of it is not a grant, but there are some state grants. What would you consider to be a grant that would, so it would be a subrecipient situation, and when would that be a contract situation where I'm using minimum school unrestricted money and I'm just contracting with somebody for a function of some kind?
So you want examples? Is that what you're asking?
Not examples per se, but when you say so this is set up as a question, are we in our agreements setting up appropriate vocabulary for subrecipient or contractor? So do we have a definition of when that would be a subrecipient and when it would just be a contract?
So there's some art and science to this. I would say we do have the definitions from the federal government, and those are included here. On the state side, we don't have definitions. I would recommend that we have definitions at some point. I think it's a good idea. But so we could use the federal definitions as a best practice, but it's outlined. That said, it's not always black and white. And so we just have to decide. And a recent conversation with some of my colleagues at a different state agency, they called their federal contact and said, okay, is this okay? And they said, as long as you document how you came up with that determination, we'll take it. As long as you're accurately, you're considering all the criteria and you make a good decision based upon that criteria, then we'll accept it. So documentation plays into how are we designating. We should have a policy and a procedure that helps us understand, okay, what's the decision tree? How do I walk through? Where do I end up with contractor? Where do I end up with subrecipient?
Go ahead.
So stop me if I'm going too far into the question, because more questions keep coming in. So I don't know how deep this conversation should go and how surface. So
We're not sure either, so
okay.
go ahead.
So I'm just going to ask the
We've got
question.
10 more minutes. Let's go.
Okay.
Well, or 7.
So I guess this leads to a different question. So when you say there are specific definitions for federal grants and we know what those are, but then we say it's best practice to use those, is that fair to an LEA to say, okay, it's best practice to use that, but if we were to audit these funds in some way or another and say, well, wait a second, federal standards say this, you should be applying them to state standards, but we've never designated that state funding should be under these same standards. So what I'm saying is if we go this route or if we feel strongly about it, we should either ask for the legislature or if there's whatever authority, we need to designate or define that here's how we're defining or using or adopting federal standards to go on, not just to say, well, it's best practice and hold people accountable to best practices when we haven't said this is the standard we're going to use when we hold you accountable for this particular stream, right?
It makes it so much more clear if we can go out and maybe using an audit example, when we start an audit, we go and identify criteria, and it's really nice when the law or the rule explicitly says this is what you're supposed to do, and then we can go look and say, did they do it? Did they do it? Did they do it? Did they do it? If there's no criteria, then we have to go out and say, what's best practice? What should they be doing?
Yeah,
well, it might be this, or it might be this, or it might be this, but then weighing against that, well, we found this and it looks like there's a discrepancy, and I can point out that maybe there's a better way, but all I can say, and we've done this in some of our audit reports, we've had to say this is just best practice, and so consider if what you're doing is prudent given best practice, but we can't say that was a violation because of what's in law. So it's a lot nicer if it's explicit.
But I agree. I think I mean, if I heard what I thought I heard, I agree. And I think that I don't want best practices to define these rules. I want definitions for purposes of the State Board of Education. This is a subrecipient. For purposes of the State Board of Education, this is a contractor. And doesn't mean that you won't run afoul of something.
Sure.
But that at least that it should be clear for purposes of the State Board of Education that this is the definition of each. Is that what you're getting at to some extent?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. And that's what I would like to see. So if you're asking, should we define this? Yes, I think that would be helpful. Did you have other thoughts? Because you said one thing led to another. Jenny? Or Cindy
go ahead.
Hey, let Cindy go, and then go ahead.
Oh, I was wondering on defining these, is that something that, and this is to dovetail off of your question, Brittany, but that we would do as a board, or we would perhaps direct staff to speak with legislators to do in code? I mean, what's the appropriate, in order to clarify some of these, if that's what we need to do, what's the appropriate place to do that?
Well, Angie may want to speak to that.
Well, one thing this conversation reminds me of is the board back in 2015, 2016 had similar conversations, and we worked with Senator Hilliard on a bill that was very, very broad, and I think in a lot of ways covered contractors when really the board only wanted to look at the subrecipients. I'm just going to use those two terms. If you're going to have two different types of groups, that it could be worth reevaluating that bill again, or a version of that, but instead of making it apply to every single person like the landscaper or the snow removal guy, to really talk about those instances and see if the legislature even wants to start with those two definitions so that the whole state is on this, using the same terms for all programs. That could even be a first step, to just even start with similar terminology. I don't know.
And I shouldn't say start with but. We could do that. We could do it through the legislature if we could find somebody to fight that battle again, or the board could still do it for purposes of the State Board of Education, could it not?
Yes, I will say that there's, in statute, when it talks about the board's authority, if you remember, right now the term third-party provider is in, I think it's third-party provider. I'm going to look right now.
Okay.
So it might be helpful to, it's 3, I think it's 401, to at least change that title. So let me find it really quickly. Education entity. I apologize. I should have.
Do you want to know a definition of third-party provider?
What I'm wondering is if these terms are in here somewhere.
I have a definition that's in board rule.
Do 401.
Oh, here it is. The state board may require by rule that if an LEA contracts with a third-party contractor, blah, 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 and third-party contractor. So I guess what I'm wondering is whether even those terms right here in this section of code could use updating.
So go ahead, Brittany.
And not just the terms, but does the state, because some of these funds come through line items or grants from the state, like the legislature through a piece of code designates it. And so it's very much a grant program. And does the legislature, or should they adopt I don't know what the right auditing terms are, but yes, that's what it is. Should they set that guidance when those things pass so that we don't just say, well, you should be using federal standards for this, but are they required? Are we going to hold people accountable to that state money on using the same federal guidance or not? And if so, I think just maybe establishing an expectation of what the legislature's intent is when they establish a grant program. How do they want us? Because we're the ones responsible for the monitoring, and how do they want that monitoring to take place, under what guidance, et cetera? Otherwise, it puts us in kind of that sticky spot of, okay, it's not best practice, but hey, there's no guidance, so do what you want with the money, right? And so I guess it's, how do you, not just defining the terms, but does the legislature want to set those standards as well?
So, go ahead, Debbie.
Oh, I was just going to say, to maybe compare and contrast to what the federal government does, obviously you have Congress that's passing laws and things like that. Well, where this comes from, these definitions, this is the Code of Federal Regulations. It's coming from the executive branch. And so what they have is they have uniform guidance. And so uniform guidance is applicable to all grants across, so education, agriculture, health, all grants. But then you also have very specific codes. We have an education code, which is 34 CFR, and we have agriculture, which is 7 or 8 CFR, right? So there are very specific things. And then there's also just this in general, follow these guidelines. So could the legislature say, yeah, we're going to have state uniform guidance, and in general, all state grants and state funds, state appropriations will follow this guidance, but we may also give you some specifics for these grant programs that need to be followed for accountability purposes to ensure that we have the performance that we need or that we want.
So your druthers is to go to the legislature to make it, to give us some of this direction rather than try to do it from the boards.
I don't know that we have the authority to set that. That's a question. So the question is would we have the authority to set that guidance on funding that comes from the legislature for a specific purpose? Yes or no? And so that would be the question to answer first. And then if it requires legislative requests, then, do you want to put some type of a guidance across education grants that would help us as we monitor these funds over time?
But there also could be it could be some of them came with those kinds of limitations. Some of the funds from the legislature came with limitations. Others would come without those limitations and would be left to the board to make its decisions about monitoring, it seems to me. Go ahead.
My preference would be that it would be fairly standard, right? Across all grant programs that would come, that there would be certain expectations of the hows of it, not like the specifics on how you spend it, but the hows of how you track it so that it's uniform, right? And so it's easy to track. So if you say certain accounting methods are required for this grant, why wouldn't they be required for this grant? Because it would be really difficult for a business administrator to keep track of things in different ways, right? And so it's just making sure that if we're going to require certain things that are easily accessed for monitoring purpose, why not create a standard so that everyone knows what that standard is and there's no confusion? Here's how we track a federal grant. Here's how we track a state grant. Maybe it's the same, maybe it's different, but who makes that decision? If we want to standardize certain uniform standards for grant flow through from the state.
Yeah, you can tell we've got a lot more discussion. Cindy, did you have one final comment?
Oh, just think there's a lot of questions on the sheet that she didn't get through in
I know.
405, so I don't know what. I'm going to allow the chair will find a solution to that,
Well,
I guess,
I
but
think
maybe
we're
we need to
supposed to-
continue or something.
I think we're supposed to stop at 4:00, and I thought we'd have a little more time to discuss this. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry to those in the audience who came to speak to this and didn't get a chance to. But did you have
I was just wondering if we can move to have this discussion continued across
That would be great.
as needed. I don't know if we feel like this is, like I said, it's kind of an odd agenda item, but it's how do we open up the discussion if we don't talk about it? So
we don't decide what we want to do, but maybe I could ask this just as not even as a motion because it's not an action item, but is it the general sense of the committee that you would like to discuss this further and either recommend some legislative action or recommend something for board rule? I don't think we have to decide that today. Is that the general sense?
I'm just asking what is it we're
Well, and that's maybe fair. And
because we've had a little discussion here. I don't know, maybe we ask the federal government to outline it for us.
Define it
I'm just saying, who are we asking to manage this for us? Are we,
It would be
and I don't even know what the management is,
And
so.
I guess maybe let me ask a simpler question. Is it the sense of the committee that you want to continue this discussion and try and come up with some, either a request for legislative direction or inquire of the federal government direction about subrecipients and contractors and their appropriate roles with the State Board of Education. That's the what I was thinking. But let's have two more comments, and we probably really should end. Cindy and then Brittany.
Well, I'd probably direct staff to work with legislation on that and clarify those definitions if we need more clarity in definitions. But then for the rest of the questions that are listed here, I think we need more time because you haven't had time to go through any of those.
No, we didn't. Brittany, did you have another thought?
So I'd like to just make a committee motion then that that based on just question number 1, not the rest of the document, just based on question number 1, when this conversation comes back, could we get some more information on what is the board's role or the legislature's role on creating some type of a uniform guidance for state grant money?
And would it help to have some legal insight about could the board do this by itself without legislative authority?
So that was my request, that, you know, that staff compile whatever information, whose role could it be to solve this question of should we have some type of a uniform guidance process for state, you know, either, I don't know if I want to be specific to grant, but grant or line item fund spending. So if there's a piece of legislation that's attached to it where we're required to monitor it, then do we need to have some type of a uniform guidance associated with those state funding so that we're not, sorry, that's the end of my motion. I won't
Well, and
keep talking.
not to belabor it now, but no, I lost my train of thought. I got exactly that far. I just, I think that that goes to something that has specific language in legislation, but it also goes to the board's general responsibility. That's my only difference of opinion with your motion, is there's certain things that the board just has a responsibility to do despite any, in addition to any pieces of legislation.
So here's the crux of my question. So the state board is responsible for monitoring many of these pieces of
specific pieces of
your
legislation.
general, but not even just in general oversight. Usually these funds, like so, K-3 literacy comes, and we are required through the piece of legislation that establishes the fund for K-3 literacy.
Right.
We are required to monitor.
Right.
Right. And so if we monitor and we use monitoring standards and we say it's best practice to use your accounting based on these federal standards, and that's what we're saying, but is it required? Because an LEA would say, well, wait a second, you're not required to hold me accountable to that accounting method, say, because it's not required anywhere in state law, it's not required anywhere. That's a federal grant standard, not a state grant standard, right? And so do we need state standards so that when we go out and monitor, we can say, wait a second, you can't report in that manner, you can't record in that manner. Here are the standards under which that has to be. Otherwise, we go out and monitor and we say, well, it would be a good idea if you did this, and then there's no accountability because we don't have the ability to say, here's the standards. So
Well,
that's all I'm asking.
Yeah, and I agree. I just think there's a whole nother piece to it of the board's general responsibility, which maybe needs standards too, but it's not always going to be directed at every single grant or piece of legislation. But Cindy, one more.
Are these-
I keep saying one more thing and one more thing.
I just don't know if these are mutually exclusive.
No,
I
I
mean,
don't think so.
because we don't want to do anything to contradict code. I mean, we could be working on this simultaneously. I don't know.
I
if
don't
there's
think there are mutually exclusive
Yeah.
at all. I think that there are some very finite standards that would apply to specific pieces of legislation, but then I think there might be other monitoring standards that are, that the board has, that a responsible board does.
What are you referring to?
But the standards could be the same. Anyway, do you have any sense of direction at all?
We're discussing it, and no, we can wait till next time.
Okay, all right.
I don't think we have an answer today.
No, nobody wants an answer today. Any other motions before, that wasn't much help.
Or are we just bringing it back?
We're bringing it back. We're bringing it back, yeah, for further discussion.
Subject to board leadership.
Yes,
Assigning
yes.
it to an agenda, but
Yes, maybe they'll give it
that's
to a
the
different
request of the
committee.
committee.
Maybe a different committee would do a better
Like
job.
finance?
Yeah. All right, I think, no, there's not, you can't really, because it's not an action item.
I think based on it, we understand that there should be another agenda item requested, and then
Yeah, and then
we'll do some
and then
research
we'll-
as staff.
that'd
Staff
be
will do some
helpful.
research. And
So they would just need the motion to adjourn. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, that wasn't very helpful, sorry.